The early 1960s. Air travel, once a luxury for the elite, was becoming accessible to the average person. Airports bustled with excitement, a gateway to dreams and distant shores. But this era of wonder had a dark side: hijackings. These weren't mere thefts, they were acts of terror that turned airplanes into high-flying prisons. Passengers boarded with smiles, unaware that their journeys could be transformed into nightmares. Each hijacking chipped away at the sense of security that defined the jet age. This event, etched in history as the world's 10th plane hijacking, would expose the fragility of peace. This is the story of National Airlines Flight 337. October 4th, 1961, dawned like any other day in Miami. At Miami International Airport, a routine scene played out. Passengers lined up to board National Airlines Flight 337. Among them was a man named Bruce Britt. Outwardly, he blended in with the other passengers. But beneath his unremarkable exterior, Britt harbored a secret, a plan born of desperation. As Flight 337 taxied down the runway and soared into the bright blue sky, the passengers settled into their seats. Stewardesses moved gracefully through the aisles, offering refreshments and smiles. But in the heart of the plane, Bruce Britt sat in silent anticipation. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Lindquist and his co-pilot ran through their pre-flight checks. Experienced pilots, they had seen their fair share of turbulent skies. Unbeknownst to them, the clock was ticking. Bruce Britt, the man at the heart of this story, was an enigma. Born into poverty, Britt's life had been a series of bad choices and missed opportunities. His criminal record stretched back to his youth, littered with petty thefts and minor offences. Each stint in jail hardened him, pushing him further to the fringes of society. Now, freshly released from prison, he found himself back in a world that offered him little hope. Jobs were scarce, and the stigma of his past followed him like a shadow. In his mind, he had nothing left to lose. Britt craved a different life, one where he could escape the drudgery of his existence. He yearned for money, power, and the respect that had always eluded him. At first, it was just a whisper in the back of his mind. He had heard stories about people hijacking planes. In those days, airport security was lax. The more Britt thought about it, the more appealing the idea became. He had smuggled a weapon on board, a small revolver hidden beneath his clothes. As Flight 337 climbed higher into the sky, so did Britt's determination. He was playing for the highest stakes: his freedom, his future, and the lives of everyone on board. The drone of the engines filled the cabin, a lullaby that masked the growing tension within Bruce Britt. He knew the time for action was approaching. He stole glances at his fellow passengers. A young couple, an elderly woman, they were oblivious, blissfully unaware of the danger they were in. Their ignorance fueled his resolve. He had convinced himself that this hijacking was a victimless crime. In his twisted logic, he was taking something from those who had plenty. He would take their money, yes, but he wouldn't hurt them. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. The fate of Flight 337 and his own destiny hung precariously in the balance. Unbeknownst to Britt, a subtle shift had occurred in the atmosphere of the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, sensing that something was amiss. Perhaps it was the way Britt kept fidgeting in his seat. Or maybe it was the way he clutched his bag, his knuckles white with tension. Whatever the reason, a sense of foreboding began to permeate the air. A young boy, seated near the front of the plane, tugged at his mother's sleeve, his eyes wide with unspoken fear. Up in the cockpit, Captain Lindquist and his co-pilot continued their routine flight checks. The hum of the engines, the steady blinking of instruments, it was a symphony of normalcy. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open. Bruce Britt, his face contorted in a mask of desperation, stood in the doorway, his small revolver glinting menacingly. "This is a hijacking!" he barked. "Nobody move, and nobody gets hurt." The hijacking of Flight 337 had begun. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The passengers on Flight 337, moments ago lost in their own thoughts, were now united by a shared terror. Britt's words, sharp and cold, cut through the hum of the engines. Eyes darted towards the front of the plane, towards the silhouette of the man with the gun. Some stared in disbelief, others instinctively ducked behind their seats. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies but never for this, stood frozen in their tracks. In that heart-stopping moment, time seemed to distort. Britt, gun still trained on the cockpit, surveyed his captive audience. "Listen up," he barked. "I'm in charge now and I have demands. I want this plane turned around. We're going to Cuba and I want $1 million in cash delivered to the plane when we land." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the fear that lurked beneath his bravado. The passengers exchanged terrified glances. Cuba. The enormity of the situation, the sheer audacity of Britt's demands, was almost too much to comprehend. Inside the cockpit, Captain Lindquist and his co-pilot exchanged a silent look. They had trained for countless emergencies, but nothing had prepared them for this. Lindquist, a seasoned pilot, took a deep breath, trying to project an aura of calm. "We hear you," Lindquist responded, his voice steady, "but we can't just fly to Cuba without refueling." Britt, his confidence shaken, paced back and forth in the aisle. "You trying to pull something?" he snarled. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Captain Lindquist's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. He knew he couldn't fly to Cuba, not with the limited fuel they had, but he also knew he couldn't afford to antagonize Britt. An idea began to form in his mind, a risky plan that hinged on deception. "All right," Lindquist said, "we'll land and refuel, but we need to find a suitable airport." Britt, his suspicions somewhat assuaged, nodded curtly. Lindquist knew he was walking a tightrope, each word, each action, a delicate balancing act. While Lindquist played for time, his co-pilot, his hands trembling slightly, discreetly reached for a hidden microphone. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to alert the outside world without arousing Britt's suspicion. In a low voice, barely audible above the hum of the engines, he uttered the words that sent chills down the spines of air traffic controllers across the southeastern United States. "Mayday. Mayday. This is National Airlines Flight 337. We have a situation on board." The message, brief but chilling, crackled across the airwaves, a distress signal that cut through the routine chatter of air traffic control. It was a call to action, a desperate plea for help from a plane held hostage at 20,000 feet. Within seconds, the news of the hijacking spread like wildfire. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and a sense of urgency gripped the air traffic control center. The eyes of the world were suddenly focused on Flight 337, a routine flight transformed into a symbol of vulnerability, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in a world on the brink of chaos. Section 3, Shadows on the Tarmac. As Flight 337 circled above, a flurry of activity erupted on the ground. At Tampa International Airport, sirens wailed as law enforcement vehicles, their lights flashing, raced towards the runway. The FBI was mobilized, SWAT teams assembled, and negotiators prepared to engage in a high-stakes standoff. The news of the hijacking spread through the airport like a virus, infecting everyone with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Passengers waiting for flights huddled around televisions, their faces etched with worry, their own travel plans suddenly insignificant in the face of this unfolding drama. Outside the terminal, a crowd of onlookers gathered, their eyes fixed on the sky, searching for any sign of the hijacked plane. News cameras rolled, capturing the scene for a world hungry for information, eager for any update on the fate of those on board. The air crackled with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging heavy in the humid Florida air. Every passing minute brought Flight 337 closer to Tampa, closer to a confrontation that would determine the fate of those on board and test the limits of courage and resolve. Section 1. Descent into Uncertainty. Captain Lindquist, his brow furrowed with concern, adjusted the controls of the Boeing 727, guiding it towards Tampa International Airport. His voice, when he spoke to Britt, remained calm, steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within him. They were descending now, the bright lights of Tampa slowly emerging from the darkness, a beacon of hope in a sky thick with tension. Inside the cabin, the passengers clung to a fragile hope. The announcement that they were landing for refueling had been met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that they were no longer hurtling towards an unknown fate in Cuba. Apprehension that the ordeal was far from over. Whispers, hushed and anxious, rippled through the cabin, punctuated by the nervous clearing of throats and the stifled sobs of children. Some passengers prayed silently, their fingers clutching rosaries or clutching the hands of loved ones. Others stared out the windows, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the city lights that seemed to be drawing closer with agonizing slowness. Britt, his nerves frayed by the unexpected turn of events, paced the aisle like a caged animal, his gun never wavering from the backs of the pilots. He barked orders, demanding to know every detail of their descent, his voice laced with suspicion, his eyes darting around the cabin, searching for any sign of treachery. The air inside the plane, heavy with the weight of unspoken fear, was thick enough to choke on. Section 2. The noose tightens. Unbeknownst to Britt, the noose was tightening. As Flight 337 approached Tampa International Airport, a carefully orchestrated plan was being put into motion on the ground. Law enforcement officials, their faces grim, their movements precise, prepared for every eventuality. The runway, bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights, resembled a stage set for a high-stakes drama, the actors poised for a confrontation that could turn deadly in an instant. SWAT teams, armed and ready, took up strategic positions around the tarmac, their shadows long and menacing in the artificial light. FBI negotiators, their voices calm and steady, established contact with the cockpit, their words carefully chosen to buy time, to de-escalate the situation, to prevent the unthinkable. Every move, every word was a calculated gamble, a delicate dance on a razor's edge. Outside the airport, the media had converged, hungry for any scrap of information, their cameras trained on the sky, their microphones thrust towards anyone who might offer insight into the unfolding drama. The story of Flight 337, a routine journey transformed into a nightmare, had captivated the nation, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of everyday life in an increasingly uncertain world. As the plane touched down on the runway, its tires screeching against the tarmac, a collective breath was held. The moment of truth had arrived. The fate of Flight 337 and the lives it carried hung precariously in the balance, suspended between hope and despair. Section 1. Legacy of a Hijacking. The Boeing 727, now still and silent on the tarmac, stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had just transpired. The passengers, shaken but alive, disembarked one by one, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. Bruce Britt, his desperate gamble having failed, was taken into custody, his dreams of freedom and fortune lying shattered at his feet. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, his name forever etched in the annals of aviation history as a cautionary tale. The hijacking of National Airlines Flight 337 sent shockwaves through the world, exposing the vulnerability of air travel. Airport security measures were heightened, passenger screening became more stringent, and a new era of vigilance dawned upon the aviation industry. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the courage of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances.